It's sometimes put to me that my work is mono-focused on religion. I say, look at the cloud behind that cloud. My driving interest is psychology, particularly issues around manipulation. Religion crops up so much of the time purely because it constitutes arguably the most systematic implementation of psychological manipulation we're ever likely to encounter in our lives. It's a smorgasbord of exploitation, but it's far from unique. Here's another one: pseudoscience. Systems of belief and practice falsely presented as the fruits of scientific method. Like clouds, religion and pseudoscience can drift into each other, but generally speaking, there's no requirement in pseudoscience to believe in any gods. Nonetheless, the social and psychological parallels are remarkable. Like religion, pseudoscience offers the false promise of easy answers to complex questions through unsubstantiated claims of esoteric knowledge. Like religion, its proponents deflect criticism with all the same fallacious defenses. Most ironic of all are the defenses that denounce science, when pseudoscience itself seeks recognition based on claims of evidence. And like religion, pseudoscience also shines a torch on the tremendous difficulties we have in acknowledging our ignorance and vulnerability. When we look at the areas of life occupied by pseudoscience, it should come as no great surprise that it's all the same territory occupied by gods, i.e. the gaps in our knowledge. We find pseudoscience mapping out false futures through prophecy, proposing false communion with the heavens. We find it offering false hope to the sick and grinding out an endless stream of false psychological gurus. If we take a closer look at those gurus, we see that, just like religion, pseudoscience can also be practiced by true believers, genuinely convinced of the validity of their work, or by non-believers, people acting for personal gain who have no belief in what they preach. As with religion, these populations can migrate either way, with some non-believers coming to believe their own publicity, and some true believers waking up from their illusions only to discover they don't have skills in any other trade, leading them to continue in a profession they privately reject. A religious example of this is the Clergy Project, an online community of priests who hold no supernatural belief, and whose membership ballooned from around 50 in March 2011 to over 400 in March 2013. Pseudoscience comes in two broad categories, which we might call kiwis and chickens. As the name suggests, kiwis are totally flightless. They provide no results, no evidence, no testable theory. Typically, phrases like vibrations and cosmic harmonics get bandied about, with requests for practical definitions for these terms leading only to ignotum per ignatius responses, i.e. explanations even more obscure than the thing they purport to explain. Examples of kiwis include crystal healing, homeopathy, Reiki, Feng Shui, and astrology. Kiwis serve as armchair pseudo-entertainment, or as window dressing to cash in on the placebo effect. Then we have chickens, concepts that can take flight for short distances with great flapping. This type contains some vestige of workable material, whether by design or happenstance, but it's weighed down by a lack of rigor, an indifference to validity, the introduction of insupportable elements, and the corruption of any reasonable components. For instance, when metaphor gets taken literally, or when phenomena that occur in some cases are overgeneralized to all cases, such as treating all illness as psychological in origin. An example of a chicken would be Scientology, which employs lie detector-like technology called e-meters that pick up subjects' physical reactions during explorations of memories and associations. These sessions are called auditing, and emotional responses show up as various swings of the e-meter needle, the goal being to nullify traumatic reactions. There are echoes of other therapeutic practices here. After all, therapy often involves the revisiting of painful memories. Phobia treatments in particular involve sustained psychological confrontation with feared subject matter until the fear reaction dies away. But Scientology's chicken status is betrayed by its underlying theory. Scientology founder Lafayette Ron Hubbard asserted that the human mind was plagued with engrams. These are mental recordings of past traumas, purportedly made when we are unconscious. Hubbard claimed that during this downtime, we continue to process every sensation around us to the last detail. Hubbard claimed these unconsciously recorded engrams are the source of our irrationality. The aim of auditing is to rid people of all their engrams, at which point they're said to achieve a state of clear and to possess formidable mental faculties. However, this might take some time, as the individual's whole existence is explored. Birth itself is considered an engram, which is why Hubbard advocated silent birth. But it stretches back further. Events before birth can generate engrams, and even events before conception. Hubbard spoke of sperm dreams, memories recorded when the individual was a sperm. Hubbard failed to provide any explanation of how a brainless gamete can perform the sophisticated cognition of recognizing itself as a sperm, let alone record its experience in memory. But we're soon drifting back further into past lives, and not just human lives. Hubbard's medical officer, Jim Dinkelsey, recalled a drug-fueled session where Hubbard fed amphetamines to his son to the point where he claimed to have regressed to a clam. Should you have the time and money to audit these prolific engrams to the state of clear, you'll then move on to auditing immortal alien spirits, known as body thetans, which Hubbard claimed are stuck to us in clusters and keep us from our full potential. From alien spirits, to past lives, to sperm dreams, to detailed unconscious recordings, none of these concepts bear even a postcard relationship to science, despite Hubbard's frequent non-specific reference to laboratory evidence. Pseudoscience seems irresistibly drawn to the concept of the unconscious. I'm not a fan of the term. I prefer to talk about things we do outside of our awareness. This puts the focus on the things we do, which anchors discussion in observable material. When we start talking about the unconscious, and speculating on what it's trying to tell us, we're already starting with a dubious, assumption-laden metaphor. And in the undisciplined hands of pseudoscientists, this unanchored foundation is liable to drift clean away into unadulterated fantasy, taking the client with it. During her therapy, Nadine Cool from Wisconsin became convinced she had been in a satanic cult, eaten babies, been raped, and had sex with animals. She came to believe she'd developed over 120 personalities, including children, angels, the bride of Satan, and a duck. She was hospitalized over 30 times because of extreme suicidal feelings brought about by the thoughts and images generated in her therapy. She also confronted her father with accusations of satanic abuse, inspired by her therapist, Kenneth Olson. Any chance of future reconciliation vanished a week later when her father died of a heart attack. In March 1997, Nadine won a $2.4 million settlement against Olson. As a result of the trial, several other former patients came forward with matching implanted fantasies. The unconscious was an exalted entity in the pseudoscience I found myself immersed in on a recent course. As I've indicated, psychology has been a driving interest of mine. I took it up academically at school and pursued it at university. After my degree, alongside a career in publishing, I continued my training, taking courses and workshops, which culminated in a final postgrad course, through which I qualified as a therapist several years ago. The staff were passionate about evidence and research. Then, a few months ago, I felt like stretching myself and applied to what appeared to be another great course, offering seminars in a huge range of subjects. The course began with a module presented as developmental psychology. I looked forward to discussing some juicy research papers. Instead, we were fed a welter of undisciplined hunch and assumption on subjects like what the fetus was thinking in utero. The nadir of that particular discourse came when it was suggested that consciousness began at conception. The speculations on the baby's mental life got truly bizarre. I'd highlight particularly egregious passages from the course literature to read out loud in the seminars. For instance, this gem, commenting on the moment babies discover their parents have a separate relationship. An early realization of the parents' independent relationship is experienced by the baby as a gigantic combined figure, penis joined with breast, stomach, mouth or vagina in endless mutual gratification, creating ever new riches in the form of feces babies. After reading that passage, I said, now, far be it from me to throw out the feces baby with the bathwater, but what a load of shit. But the staff member we were with had drifted away into a reverie of admiration, remarking on the wonderfully rich language. As befits a chicken, there were islands of supportable concepts. Defenses, for instance, represent entirely observable behaviors. We can see people splitting experience into false dichotomies of black or white, saints or sinners, virgins or whores, heaven or hell. We can see people displacing onto more acceptable targets. The late Christopher Hitchens observed another common defense, reaction formation, as demonstrated in the almost clockwork regularity with which anti-homosexual polemicists get discovered in flagrante delicto. Models were also offered that acknowledge how we reenact in therapy our behaviors outside it. Again, no problem. That's a bit obvious, isn't it? Client complains that people always let him down. It becomes clear they let him down because he asks such unreasonable favors. Requests to borrow unfeasible amounts of cash, or drive him to the airport right that second. Am I surprised when I start letting him down too? No, it's one of the games he plays with people, and chances are he'll play it with me. Concepts like these are observable, but pseudoscientists aren't satisfied confining themselves to the observable. Like Icarus, they try to fly higher than their false wings will take them. In this case, the wings of intuition. And like Icarus, the result is one big burnt bird. Throughout the course, as with all pseudoscientific enterprises, there was no interest in criteria for establishing validity. Instead, it was suggested that we should simply stick with the ideas we personally liked. Me and another student from a scientific background were very outspoken in our criticisms. But in contrast to previous courses, criticism wasn't welcome. As is characteristic of pseudoscientific practitioners, instead of engaging with criticism, course leaders sidestepped it, became defensive, dejected, passive-aggressive, and resorted to personal put-downs. In response to my criticisms of Jung's coincidence-denying concept of synchronicity, rather than address the content of my comment, one course leader told me I should be more open-minded. I replied that having an open mind meant being willing to hear new ideas, not having to accept them. I said the mind shouldn't be like a bucket, letting everything in without discrimination. That was gullibility. It should be like a sieve, applying a critical filter to what we're told, and rejecting what was unjustified. After a pseudo-thoughtful pause, the course leader cheerfully announced that she was a bucket. It was an asinine response. It was also untrue, as she proved countless times. For instance, she was pseudo-analyzing me one time, and I happened to cough. She pounced on it, saying her comments had clearly touched something. I pointed out that, as she well knew, I'd had a chest infection for 5 weeks. But she'd already formed a theory about this cough that confirmed her analysis, and wouldn't entertain any other explanation. Had she been the bucket she claimed to be, she would have been able to hear other explanations. She was worse than a bucket. She exemplified another defining feature of pseudoscience: rampant confirmation bias. In his famous paper on being sane in insane places, Rosenhan showed the damaging effects of confirmation bias in psychological assessments. He organized the admission of 8 fake patients into 12 different psychiatric hospitals. On arriving, they complained of hearing voices, which seemed to say the words empty, hollow, and thud. That's all. They gave genuine accounts of their life histories, changing only their names and professions. And upon admission, they ceased reporting any abnormal symptoms, and behaved on the wards as they normally would. They followed instructions, but didn't ingest any medicine, and engaged in conversation and journal writing to pass the time on wards where there was little to do. In 11 out of 12 cases, subjects were diagnosed with schizophrenia. Rosenhan noted how the fake patients' life histories were distorted by the staff to fit popular ideas about schizophrenic onset. Normal negative reactions to mistreatment by staff were taken as manifestations of disturbance. With 3 patients, even their journal writing was pathologized. Rosenhan also observed that just sitting outside a cafeteria a short while before it was due to open was diagnosed by one practitioner as indicating oral acquisitive pathology. The Pseudoscience Institute I attended was rife with these pathologizing biases. Mistreatment by staff was consistently deflected back on the students with pseudo-analytical nonsense. When I complained to the heads of the institute about one staff member's serious violation of ethical guidelines, they suggested my problem with her was that she reminded me of someone else, possibly my mother. I couldn't quite believe the cliched drivel I was hearing. I said, "I'm sure if I came over there and slapped you round the face, we could have a fascinating discussion of the people I remind you of. But the fact would remain, I slapped you round the face. Just like the fact remains that that staff member violated ethical guidelines." I could appreciate why most students became apathetic about challenging these deflections. It's hard to convey the sheer volume of them, or the sheer stubbornness of the staff. But I resolved to bulldoze through every deflection that came my way. Predictably, resistance increased at first. At times I'd have 3 staff members firing interpretations at me all at once. But over time, resistance slackened as I made it clear I wouldn't be sidetracked. Of the many instances of abuse I witnessed and experienced, the standout conflict was a series of exchanges I had with a supervisor about my throat. Last year, in part 1 of my mini-series on death, I shared that I had a throat problem which was initially suspected to be cancer, but found to be benign. The condition means my voice gets tired faster than it used to, and with prolonged use over a day, it can become uncomfortable, then painful. I've learned to cope by taking periods of rest and just not overdoing it. When I shared this information at the Institute, to my bewilderment, one of the course supervisors deliberately pushed me to do quantities of sustained reading in her session that I'd indicated were out of the question. Our exchanges fell into a pattern. I would decline to read, She would become insistent and argumentative until I got angry and shut the interaction down. Incredibly, the very same thing would happen the next time. I got in touch with the accrediting body of the course, who were appalled and told me her behavior was not only unethical, but illegal. Professional or educational institutes are legally obliged to make what are technically termed reasonable adjustments to accommodate any physical incapacity that prohibits certain activities. In my case, a reasonable adjustment simply meant that someone else reads. But more to the point, pressurizing me to read could be construed as harassment. I took this to the heads of the institute. They fumbled a meek defense that my supervisor had interpreted my throat condition as a psychological condition, a manifestation of some unconscious anxiety. I said that was completely unacceptable. I'd made it absolutely clear to her that it was a diagnosed condition for which I'd had extensive tests. I said I hadn't asked for her opinion, and she was not medically qualified to give one. I was furious. They nodded gravely and assured me my throat condition would now be respected. But I knew this supervisor was directing students to disregard their clients' medical conditions in similarly damaging ways. For instance, one student had a client who'd lie on the floor during therapy because he found sitting painful. Without any medical inquiry, the supervisor directed the student to get that client to sit in the chair, declaring that the client's avoidance of the chair was an unconscious attempt to sabotage the therapy. The student privately expressed serious misgivings about this coercion, but nonetheless did as he was told. Steven Weinberg famously said that for good people to do evil things, that takes religion, but the same could easily be said of pseudoscience. These students were good, sensitive people. I felt sad for them, but I felt much sadder for their clients. And that's what makes me angry, the horrendous abuse of clients. Chantal Levine was reported to have been cooked to death as part of a course run by self-styled self-help guru Gabrielle Frechette. The session in which Levine died was part of a seminar aptly entitled Dying in Consciousness, in which Frechette, who also claimed to channel a biblical figure called Melchizedek, had left Chantal, along with 8 others, covered in mud, wrapped in plastic, then covered in blankets with boxes over their heads for 9 hours, with the instruction to hyperventilate. Normal body temperature is 37 degrees. Chantal arrived unconscious at hospital with a temperature of 40.5. It was reported that Frechette denied responsibility, that she felt her duty was fulfilled by calling 911, and that she continued to offer bookings. Chantal had spent nearly $19,000 on this fatal course. Bruce Hines recounted how his Scientologist sister died from breast cancer. She had achieved the highest possible level in Scientology at the time, operating Thetan 8. Hines explained that in the almost godlike operating Thetan state, you were supposed to be able to leave your body at will, to be assured of your immortality, and to suffer no physical troubles. His sister's cancer was slow-moving and easily operable. But while Hines acknowledged that many cautious Scientologists take normal medical treatment, his sister chose not to, believing that auditing would take care of it. She died age 55. Candace Newmaker was just 10 years old when she was suffocated in a session of pseudoscientific attachment therapy. This vile practice involves the forcible psychological regression of children who fail to bond with a parent. Candace was pinioned under a blanket by 4 adults and directed to push herself out of it in a simulation of rebirth to encourage her to bond like a baby with her adoptive mother. Despite Candace screaming that she couldn't breathe and that she was dying, there was no respite. One of her pseudo-therapists, Julie Ponder, even taunted her, saying, "Go ahead and die right now. For real. For real." After 40 minutes, Candace had spoken her last word and stopped moving. Even so, Ponder continued the abusive ranting, calling her a quitter. When we attempt to run before we can walk, we fall over. And that's what we see with pseudoscience all the time. People falling over into abuse, bankruptcy, illness, and death. I suspect that'll continue until we learn to respect the gaps in our knowledge, to approach them with curiosity and discipline, rather than fill them with the easy answers of pseudo-knowledge. In short, to become gap-friendly. Which brings me to skepticism. Skepticism is not only the most intellectually honest position, it actively crowbars a gap of thought between stimulus and response, so that we don't react in pat, non-thinking reflexes. We stop to consider. We act with more awareness and spontaneity. Skepticism could have crowbarred a gap of thought into Candace Newmaker's killers, who might have stopped to investigate her cries, rather than numbly dismiss them. Skepticism could also help chickens evolve to fly long distance if they streamlined their billowy excesses and started applying serious discipline to their lazy, whack theories. In view of everything I've said about pseudoscience, don't think me a hypocrite if I end by proposing a new metaphorical pseudoscience of my own, a kind of avian alchemy. Let's turn these kiwis and chickens into dodos.